Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
I see the world a lot more like the ocean. There's a wave of change, and another wave of change, and another wave of change. And what we need to try here is to navigate it, to surf it.
Who is Claudio Perron, and what's been your journey?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's really great. So if we go back to the early days, I guess I used to be a chief solution architect in some large organization when it was still cool to be an architect, right? and at some point, I remember there was somebody talking about extreme programming, and I remember we were talking about design patterns and stuff like that. And this guy was really cool. I met him in Seattle. Turns out it was Gregor Hope from ThoughtWorks back then. Then he moved to Google and whatever. So a real pioneer, right? And he was very humble, like he said, because I said, how do you know all this stuff? We're really talking really interesting levels. And first of all, he said, look, I come from Java. We had a lot more time to over-engineer everything. So we have patterns for everything. That's great. And then I asked him, what kind of methodology do you use? And he said, well, it's something called extreme programming. I said, extreme programming? I heard about this. This is about spaghetti code, right? You don't need documentation. You don't need this. I'm Italian. I can do spaghetti. And but anyways, there was something that just didn't click between, I used to come from, I used to do big projects with rational unified process, like use case driven stuff and whatever. And anyways, when he talked about that, I started to investigate this because it just didn't, there was something that didn't click in some way. And so I got exposed to extreme programming, and from then on, it's been a long journey, I guess, since 2001. Yeah. And your, perception of agility as well evolves over time, and you see, the ups and downs, and you always have new generations, I guess. Relearning maybe something we often forget as well as a community. So anyways, I started with that. Then, like many, I guess, have been influenced a lot by Lean. So started with extreme programming, used Scrum as well for a number of years. I've been doing a lot of Kanban methods, particularly, and anyways, I've been really infected by Lean, and I'm pretty much like you, I guess. When you like something, you want to go deep into that, and I really wanted to understand what was at the core of Toyota, because in the end, what happens, Lean is what the Americans understood or what the Japanese were doing, now further translated by an Italian back to a Serbian, whatever. So you can imagine how all these things get to be, modified and whatever. So I went back to basics, I guess, and I learned I studied a lot of manufacturing books and things like that. And one thing that I realized was that in Toyota, they are extremely good problem solvers. And the tools that they are known for are just the manifestation of the solutions of the problems that they had. These are not necessarily the problems we have, right? And so if you start looking at this level, I realized that the core of this was actually this systematic analysis, this problem solving that they did. So anyways, that's when I started actually experimenting. Also because I used to be a chief technology officer for a company in Ireland. We were the new company of the year. I know I sound Italian, sort of mixed with I don't know what. But actually, I'm Italian. I'm still living actually in Ireland for the last 21 years or so. And so at some point, I've been involved in a number of startups. And the one that actually had a significant potential for growth. In fact, we won an award as the new company of the year. And as I often say, in a very lean and agile way, we went very efficiently out of business, burning $15 million, something like that. Ouch.
It's all relative, you know.
It's all relative, absolutely. And but the thing was, I know Kent Beck talked about that, like thinking in terms we feel betrayed in a way, right? We study Agile, we think we are good, we're doing really well. And as a consultant, actually, the very first consultancy job I got, a CIO asked me, I'm looking at this, and you were really good. You, not as me, you as a company, right? It was a really good team. But if you were so smart, why did you fail? I mean, seriously, for 3 years, I've been thinking about this, right? We were smart. We did a lot of stuff. Back then we were gold certified partners. I would personally decompile .NET code on the fly, inject instruction, recompile, because we were agile, and Microsoft back then didn't give us like the right tools for actually testing, and the basic things. So we were doing really hardcore stuff, and yet we failed. And it wasn't until further down in that lean startup emerged, and I realized that the territory in which we operated was a territory of extreme uncertainty. And in a territory of extreme uncertainty, there are certain assumptions, I guess, that are just assumptions. You need to experiment.
Validate,
Yeah, I don't know if you know anything about complexity, but effectively it's a complex system. And so the strategy there is not the analysis, it's not root cause analysis, is probing,
Exactly.
right? I play chess, right? I make a move, I wait for the system to reply back, and based on that. So if you think about that, though, it sounds like inspect and adapt, doesn't it? Like I probe, in a way it's a push for inspection, but I launch an inspection, I see how the system reacts, and then I adapt. And so anyways, I started using a lot of lean startup, which I actually felt, at least at the time, really embraced a lot of what actually Agile in principle was supposed to be, right? Because let's face it, for a long time, I think in Agile we've been somewhat complacent. We either learn one methodology or the other, and there's the wars with methodologies, but we're actually, really missing, and then there are those endless discussions about be agile versus do agile. Be agile means I am, I follow my knees are sore because I'm in front of the manifesto, versus the do agile. You're just doing Scrum, right?
Yeah, that's one of the topics that I wanted to discuss with you, and maybe we can touch upon it later. But it's one of those things, like recently what people have been talking about, like change the mindset or change the culture versus change the system, and it's an endless kind of doing agile versus being agile. It seems like those discussions have no end.
But I think there are answers and observations you can make, right? So from lean, for example, I understand that culture is something that comes for free. So you change the systems that let emerge a certain mindset, right? And so you don't start with principles. And in fact, I remember I won't name the company, a really large company, and global. So they asked me to help them in some transformation, and they had the base in Italy, headquarter in Germany, whatever. And so it was funny because it was an agile journey, and it was a parallel journey. So the Italians, when I went there were a lot of issues. Like they were saying, for example, that a really complicated software, 660 people working on this. We're talking about quite complex, and I remember talking to a manager who was not even looking at me in the eyes and say, "We will never go live. We will never go live." Essentially, was the following version. At the time there were like 1 year releases of all this stuff, and they were really struggling to go live. And I looked, and it was all like very I can't say it, divided in compartments.
Yeah.
Essentially, you would have, there's a Z somewhere, so you would have like developers in one building, the testers were in a completely different building. And so, you know, we can talk about, of course, like we know the answers, right? Cross-functional teams, a value stream, maybe, and whatever. Anyways, in the end, that's exactly what we did. We used back then actually a mix. Some people were using the Kanban method, others were using Scrum, others, quite rightly, they put the two things in between. But what we did, pretty much, we moved 650 people in 3 days. Only the Italians can do it, right? I mean, seriously. With it's not that we had like 80 coaches or whatever. There was me. At some point, there were other 3, so there were 3 of us actually working there. And anyways, like in a very short amount of time, we made a big difference because you visualize the work in progress, you put people together, you skip a lot of steps that otherwise would be very bureaucratic and whatever. The same story happened in Germany, where for a year they talked about the principles of lean. And apparently at the end of the year, it literally took a year. Because, you know, I understand, maybe you want to really understand really well how things are supposed to work. So what they did was this kind of extensive training, which lasted so long that at the end, when they were ready to start, the teams were moved elsewhere to other projects. So there was this kind of contrast of different attitudes. So my personal attitude is essentially systems to begin with. You create effectively the system that let a particular culture emerge, because
you've described culture as a shadow in the past.
It's like there is really like a triangle where the assumption is you need to change the mindset so that people are, you know, are more efficient, effective, and blah, 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 so they can change method. And instead I suggest, like with a little experiment, instead you make an observation. You actually say, I see this problem here. Do you agree? If you don't agree, how do you see it? And essentially we get agreement on the problem. And then once we agree, and if it's not this problem, maybe it's another problem, right? I tend to hack systems, right? And culture is one of them, right? Company culture. And I find that the weakest spot, or the entry point, not the weakest spot, the entry point is problems. Because we all disagree about how to go about things. It's very hard. But if you start actually thinking about the problem, that's what I would look at. Let's agree on the problem. I see it this way. It's my opinion. Probably is my perception of reality. I may be wrong. I may be terribly wrong. But do you see it's the same? You may say, maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe I see it this way. Okay. In the end, you get to a consensus, I guess, on the problem. And based on that, maybe you make other observations and you start thinking, what options do we have?
So it's almost like a way to engage, especially when you look at like executives who are busy, like, you know, if you don't talk about the problems and how that relates to their problems, they got other things to worry about. So it's almost mindset. Like,
absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, like if you think about that, I moved to Lean Startup, actually doing a lot of innovation. And I went to Boston actually at a conference. It was a Kanban conference. And there was a guy called Jeff Henderson, who made this realization. You know, Lean Startup was just born, and what he did was he had this really good intuition. Was actually to say the territory of extreme uncertainty is not just what the Lean Startup guys are talking about. It's not just you launch a product and now you have a market. That's the territory of extreme uncertainty, right? I can plan it for 10 years, and when I launch it, I cross fingers and hope that will come, right? He made this observation, and the observation was the territory of extreme uncertainty is also how change happens in how people react to change, how change happens in organizations. And the way he went about it, you know, he went his own way. You know, there was quite a bit disagreement. I wasn't 100% sure on the way he applied it. But I made this observation for my startup work. I created like tons of experiment boards, because Lean Startup talks about, create experiments. And then everybody was there back then with pretty much Excel spreadsheets trying to, to make it work. So I said, no, let's go back to basics. Let's study the scientific method. And I created several boards. And when I heard Jeff, I had this realization saying, you're right. You're totally right. Let's apply my boards to how people within organization change, okay? How react to change? How do we make decisions? So the entry point is actually to say, let's help creating a decision cycle, right? And that's where popcorn flow effectively.
I was gonna say, is that when the popcorn flow was
Absolutely.
born? That's the origin.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I created, actually, there was a distributed team. There were some politics, like with a core company, some other consultancy company. Anyways, things didn't go so well. So we started negotiating change. How did we do it? Well, I put a Trello board, literally, with columns. They weren't exactly these columns, but roughly was problems, options, possible experiments, committed, ongoing, review, next. And with that, we negotiated sprint after sprint. I mean, literally retrospective after retrospective. We negotiated everything from what tools to use to, even Trello was negotiated. I remember, there were options like, you use the tool Jira. That you have, but Jira, we had Linkit, whatever. Yeah. But the thing was, one guy said, oh, we used Trello before. Okay, let's use that. It's not ideal for the kind of work, but it's better than nothing, right? And that's
so
what
maybe just before we move forward, like there are probably listeners that never heard of popcorn flow. So maybe just describe it a little bit. You just kind of went through, problems, observations, options, possible experiments, what we're going to commit, ongoing review next. But just maybe give people a little bit more insight or overview of what popcorn flow is.
Yeah. So popcorn flow captures, to begin with, I mean, there is those aspects, those steps, and I'll explain them in a moment. But really what it does is that it captures what I would call a pragmatic, anti-fragile philosophy. Okay, I'm introducing a new term, which is anti-fragile. But the anti-fragile part, I guess, it comes from Nasir Taleb, right? And pretty much he says that, we have things that are fragile, like a glass, full of something, water, doesn't have to, but I put some external pressure and it breaks. That's obviously is fragile. And what he says is the opposite of fragile is not robust. Robust is like something that effectively, no matter what, or till a certain point, you put some pressure, external pressure, and remains effectively the same. We have lots of examples of robustness, right? You could have servers on the back end,
or something,
a wall, whatever. So that pretty much is robust. Now, the opposite, however, of fragile, it's something that the more you shake it, the better it becomes. That's an interesting, and he calls that anti-fragile. So what can it be anti-fragile? Well, one example is in nature. If you do exercise, muscles, for example, your body overcompensates, and because of that, you get healthier, right? If you do running, you do whatever. So we become healthier, and those kind of systems actually need variation in a way. They need those external factors. So popcorn flow tries to embrace effectively that aspect, and I can explain a million examples of that. But anyways, this philosophy is based pretty much on 5 principles and the decision cycle, a 7-step decision cycle that I quickly mentioned. And the principles are, if change is hard, make it continuous. That really comes from the idea of that we learned as developers, actually, with continuous deployment, for example. Continuous integration, the idea that, again, once upon a time I used to integrate once a year. then we used to integrate. I mean,
some
seriously.
companies, maybe I hope no, I hope that that doesn't exist anymore. But I wouldn't be surprised if I heard that some companies still do that. But hopefully not.
Yeah, growth, man. Whatever I can say. No, but it does happen. There are challenges, and of course, to move from a deployment once in a while to continuous, well, it's challenging as well, depending on the systems you have. I'm pretty sure a lot of legacy systems are still like that.
Yeah.
But the idea was, what did we learn, right, with that, with continuous integration? Instead of waiting at the very end to, because I have time to put all my bugs for months and months, you have time to put all your bugs for months and months. Nobody really checks them. We put them together, and now we have a combination of our bugs, and it could take forever to fix them. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to predict how long it would take, right? So instead of doing that, what we learned was, let's integrate more often. In fact, ideally, let's integrate. We started having weekly builds, and where you would have testing, and then daily builds and continuous builds. So that's the idea. And the big question is, why don't we do that with change? A lot of companies make big announcements of big change initiatives, and then they complain that people are scared. Well, they are scared because it's a lot of change. And in fact, the observation is that usually you have new initiatives every 6 months, maybe. In certain companies, that's true. Why? Because the first doesn't work. And so you try again with some new stuff. And so the thing is, right, but what if instead of doing that, we did as we learn to do in software development, which is, let's do a little change, but all the time.
You call it the virus principle, like the way the virus changes.
Yes, I know. That was before COVID.
Before COVID, yeah.
makes me laugh. But there is this observation that effectively certain viruses do evolve like very, very fast, and in fact, actually, apparently every 15 minutes even. Yeah. And so, why don't we do that? And that's my aspiration, is to make experiments and to change.
And I think, when I think about it, it's like, a lot of times we talk about, it's not about just doing Agile or even being Agile. It's just something that you do. You don't even call it Agile, right? And when you think about that type of change, it's part of your identity. It just becomes who you are. And I think like if in organizations, it's that type of environment that you want to create, where everybody's thinking about change, embracing, running these small experiments rather than just saying, "Oh, we need to."
I mean, in the early days, I did ask myself, "Am I agile? Am I agile enough?" I remember asking my peers. I don't ask that anymore because, first of all, it's blatant. First of all, it's not about being agile or doing agile. It's more like, because doing agile means, in the context of people who are not maybe familiar with that, it means you don't understand the principles. You're just applying, whatever the rules of the book, but you don't understand it, right? And to me, the point being is, I think I understand Agile quite a bit. I've been around the blocks for a while. But you know what? There are days that I realize I'm not Agile. When I'm not Agile, when I didn't change anything of my own status quo, if I do things the same way I've been doing them before, if I didn't run an experiment. So it shouldn't be or do, it should be when. Yeah. When? It's like being happy. You can't be constantly happy. It's a state of the mind that I don't think is continuous. Like, it's something that,
It's also, I think, environment. I was talking, who was I talking to about, like, just describing it as more as, Jorgen.
Jorgen Appel?
No, Jorgen Hasselhoff. And we were talking and using analogy as fitness. And it's like, agility is like fitness. Like, when I used to play soccer in college, like there's certain level of fitness that was expected from me versus when I'm playing with 50-year-olds. What's expected of me versus, like, if it's just a pickup game, where it is. And like, it's context specific, and certain levels of agility are appropriate to whatever the context is.
Absolutely. And to me, the way I look at it, translated in my own world in a way, is experiments, essentially, right? I do introduce change via experiments. And so sometimes experiments, and it is like popcorn in a way that you have seeds on a pan, right?
Yeah.
And you put it and you hit it. At the beginning is really hard or seems really hard, and then they pop.
Starts
Right?
going.
And this kind of feeling as well, that there are certain environments when it really, really is hard to change from where you are, right? But I totally agree with you.
And that's is that the flow? I mean, like there's the flow, but there's also once you get into that flow of continuous change, and like it's almost like it kind of generates more flow because you kind of get addicted to these little small experiments and you see the value in running those.
Absolutely. I've been working with teams where they literally generated 5 to 10 experiments a week. It's not common. Certainly the 10 is not common. But just to say, like, and they've been using Park and Flow, for example, for years at this point. And I remember once with a client, he was actually, their client was making an observation and saying, wow, like this team changed, like it's incredible what happened. Because imagine, right? So what you do, a continuous inspect and adapt, right? You're improving the way you're working, you make observations, you generate options, and you begin launching experiments. Then you make observations on the results. You know, there's a gap between your expectation and reality. And then effectively you make modifications. So you start with some experiments, but those experiments by themselves change the system around. So you make,
but they also and they changed like what I've seen also the way that we see things. So by actually running experience, like dynamics and all that.
Absolutely. In fact, actually, principle number 2 here in Park and Flow says it's not what you do, but also what you learn by doing it that matters.
Exactly.
Okay, we know that with Agile, right? Very mature Agile teams, they definitely, it's not about, you know, they don't do retrospectives of we had a bug here. It's more like, yeah, we had a bug and we have, but that is not seen as just a mistake in itself. It's seen as maybe this bug is a result of the system that we are using to actually create code, which generates bugs. So how can we prevent this to happen in the future, or reduce the likelihood that this happens in the future? And the thing is, like, this is learning. It's not just the doing, it's the learning, right? We do that in retrospectives, but very often those retrospectives are, how can I say, you keep them internally, you forget about the next retrospective. Maybe you have outcomes and perhaps you use that, but everything else is lost. And you want to do that in a very systematic way, or at least that's what we are trying to do with Park and Flow, is to track all these experiments that we're actually doing. We're tracking what led to those experiments, the reason effectively that we're doing this. And so it's like to say, let's put black on white how the team is thinking. Okay, and that's one way to look at it.
I mean, it's almost like pausing. It's so easy to like jump into and say, oh, let's just do this without any reflection. I think anytime we take time to reflect, we learn. So I see that a lot with teams too, where it's, you know, I joke around, you know, it seems like the only person that's excited to be there for the retrospective is the Scrum Master. But there's no that, like the desire to, you know, reflect, take a pause, reflect, and say, okay, what have we learned, and what, you know, what are we gonna do based on what we learned?
And one psychological trick, I guess, that I learned, we talked about that before, is that in the retrospectives you need to talk about shared problems. Shared problems. I know, you know, we try to do it in every retrospective. It's not, but very often, you know, sometimes we find ourselves saying we should do this or we should do that. That's the solution. What's the problem? And do you agree with that problem? You know, and so you need to pull everybody in the team to actually share the pain. If they share the pain, that's a problem worth solving, and then you start running perhaps better retrospectives, right?
And that's is that like what you call the freedom principle, in a sense, like where you have shared opinions?
Yeah.
Could you maybe talk about that?
Yeah. So the principle actually says everybody's entitled. It's a bit long, unfortunately, but everybody's entitled to their own opinion, including myself, including maybe a consultant who just arrived, looks at the code and says, "This code sucks." Right? I see it. Now, but a shared opinion is a fact. What it really means, and I hope it won't be called the Trump's principle or something like that, right? It's not about creating facts in that way. Within the context of Park and Flow, what it really means is everybody's got freedom to express their own opinion, opinions to which you may disagree, okay? And in fact, very often I would write like a post to describe it. I will put my name there or write my avatar, whatever, and say what it means effectively is, it's my opinion. This is how I see the world. And the world could be that the code is actually really bad or, in whichever field really. And at that point, I asked, but do you agree? Or we may prioritize them. This is the way I see the world. Do you see it the same way? If we all do, let's treat it as if it was a fact. It's not a real fact, okay? This principle needs to be seen in a very, not literal way, I guess. But the idea
it reminds me of really like empathy, understanding like that other people have different values, different views, different perspectives, and just saying I'm gonna honor those values, perspectives, perceptions, and I expect that you're gonna honor mine, and let's try to find some common ground where we agree. I think that's the power of that principle.
What I find interesting is that Popcorn Flow was born out of needs, out of not in my work. Well, part in my work, but the other part was actually with my son. He's Asperger, right? I mean, he's been, working towards, is super intelligent, whatever. But he's also the perfect traditional project manager, right? So he needs to be in control of everything, which works really well with things, a little bit less with people, right? As you can imagine. So to me, if I say to him, especially when he was 5, but even now, like under a lot of aspects, if I say to him, we should do this, I don't have 50-50. It's not like they would say yes or no. It would say no. Okay, of course, it would say no. Because it didn't come from him, and because I didn't prepare him for this. So that's how Popcorn Flow actually was born on the idea of actually, it has to be so simple that even a 5-year-old kids can understand the basic principles. And then the observation was, so what do I start with? The problem. What problem? Not mine, his problem. We try to have that kind of common view on the problem. And then I would elicit options and say, okay, if we agree that we have this problem, what options can we come up with? Because I have one, and usually that's not the one that is chosen. in this case. But there would be other options, and then you would go with one of them. So from the psychological point of view, what you try to do with your team or your organization, it's not just Popcorn Flow actually is not used just with teams. Certainly not just software development teams. As you take decisions, pretty much, you start eliciting options from others. So you get convergence on the problem. You elicit different options. People have been co-designing options together. And so it belongs to them a lot more. There was, I really like, it opens my heart when sometimes you have stakeholders who actually say, that was a great idea. Who had it?
And I think
I remember scenes where we look around and we say, well, I don't know, we did. It didn't belong to anyone. Maybe someone can start like thinking about a particular option, but then we develop it together.
That's that co-creation. And that's also reminds me of a couple of things. It reminds me of like the importance of like when you converge on a certain problem, right, and you start diverging on the options, it's much better because that convergence happened on the problem, so we have alignment, and it's much easier to diverge when you actually have that alignment on the problem.
And the other thing I want to add, though, that these problems are not problems. They are your perception that something is a problem, that I agree that is a problem, and we both agree it should be a problem that we need to address now. Okay, so it's perception built on top of perceptions. I want to say that because I started from the scientific method, and then I realized, well, these are not real facts. They're just opinions. What scientific
it's just what we make up.
Yeah, it starts on shared opinions. Of course, as we go ahead and we learn more about our environment, we may realize that that was not the problem. That maybe the problem was something else. So we're, I like to use this idea of the skateboard or surfing even, right? When you're in the middle of the ocean, you don't try to tame the ocean. It's not that the world is done of concrete, as somebody told me, I have like feet on the ground. I said, yeah, you think the world is made of concrete, right? The problem is, if you're on concrete, the ocean is over you, is on top of you. And so I see the world a lot more like the ocean. There's a wave of change, another wave of change, and another wave of change. And what we need to try here is to navigate it, to surf it. And once you know, and you have the tools to actually surf it, then you will go ahead and go to Australia to actually surf the biggest and most majestic waves. That's the way I'm looking at it. That really is what it means to be anti-fragile, is to look at the opportunities. The more change there is, the more opportunities there are to embrace it.
Embrace them, to
exploit it, So that's the idea. And so anyways, just to finish on a couple of two principles, it's not fail fast, fail often, it's learn fast, learn often, which I call, in fact, the skateboarder principle. That's because fail fast, fail often is something that we often say in Lean Startup. But this failure, the gap between your expectation and reality that we will put in an experiment, it's not frustration, it's the actual learning. Is when things don't go the way you expected, that you start thinking, why is it that? We start thinking. You see, we're all capable. Most of us are capable of wonderful thinking, but we don't think very often. We start thinking when things don't go other way. And the final principle is small bets, big payoff. And that's really is about the core of optionality and anti-fragility. It really means there are certain experiments that most of them may fail, but then there's a unicorn, the one that actually changes your career. So you need to put yourself on actually saying, what are my little bets, right? My little experiments that I can do that maybe have a high potential for payoff. One example, I know you were organizing conferences, right? And before COVID, I was supposed to come to.
I know.
It didn't happen. And I often think about this. Who goes to conferences, right? If you go to a conference with, you may have like several parallel tracks, for example. If you're not doing the keynote, now you're in competition, right? With all the different tracks as a speaker. But the audience now, they have a really great, they need to place bets pretty much. They're running experiments, right? And they say, okay, at the same time, I have, 4 slots, let's say. Which one do I go to? Well, it could be a title based on the title. How do you make your preference? Based on the title, based because you saw the guest on your on the podcast, because I heard about this person, because I know about this matter, whatever. You go there and you make a choice. That's a little experiment that you're running, and it could more or less have some form of payoff, some value. At worst, I lost some time. So you do throughout the day, maybe you do this conference, I'm experimenting on this, experimenting on the next slot, I'm going to this, experimenting on the next slot, and whatever. And some of them give you value. Other speeches don't give you any value, not maybe because the speaker was bad, it's because maybe the topic, after all, wasn't actually what you're looking for in your life in that particular time. If you fast forward maybe 2-3 years, you possibly forgot everything about that. So my argument is that most of them have no value. There's a big chance. However, you're anti-fragile to the possibility that you find one talk, and it may be just one discussion on the corridor, someone you meet that completely changes your career. Changes, whatever, changes the principles, launches, in my case, launches Spark on Flow, whatever. Okay, so that idea, we are anti-fragile. Going to a conference is being anti-fragile to the possibility that we learn something that can really change us. I may make the same case for your podcast, right? We have options these days, and we can choose and whatever, but are you doing it in that kind of mindset of actually saying this can actually change my career?
Well, there's two perspectives. There's two perspectives on. By the way, I want to know if you have a name. I know you didn't have a name for the fifth principle.
I call it the option trader principle, but it could be the same as the VC, like venture capitalists, right? Yeah. Where effectively what they do is you need to be right only once, right? You place a bet on 10 startups, and then it's one that actually. So I'm not afraid actually to fail my own experiments. Like an experiment could be, I don't know, we have this problem, and I don't know, management will never allow us to use this or that. Okay, maybe, but what options we have? Well, one option is to talk to management. Okay, that's one option. Let's do an experiment. The experiment could be that very concretely, we do an interview, we talk to this manager, blah, blah, blah. We prepare for it. And our expectation is that at the end of this meeting, we will have the agreement of going in this direction. Okay, so we are optimistic on that experiment. So it's a little thing. I can test in 3 days, maybe 1 day, maybe 3 hours, whatever, maybe an hour. So it's very quick from that point of view. Again, the payoff may be huge, but because it's just a little experiment, I can do it. Even if you don't totally agree with me, you think it's a total waste of time. It's just a quick experiment. Let's do it. You know, it's coherent.
And that's really what this podcast is about. I started writing a book, and then I just kind of hit a writer's block. And really, like, the experiments that I'm running with the podcast is like, I'm going to talk to this person for an hour, and I might learn something, I might not, I might validate, but it's a low kind of investment. Like, I'm going to share my thoughts. I'm going to, and if I learn something, great. If not, maybe somebody else, I'll share the conversation, and somebody else might, they might pick up something. And it's really just a bunch of these experiments where I'm personally doing it for my own kind of learning process. And I'm saying, like, if I talk to these people, there's a good chance that I'll learn something.
Yes, absolutely. And you're doing that. We are all learning. We're all learning, just watching what you're doing. Like, it's amazing. But so the point, to go back to the idea of agility, right? Once you get to a point where that popcorn pops, because these are the principles, and then you have the decision cycle, right? As I was saying, we talked already about it, problems, options. So imagine you have an experiment board and you track down, here are the problems, options, possible experiments, committed, ongoing review. Based on the review, what are we going to do next? And this opens new experiments. So it's pretty systematic, I guess. But anyways, like the point being is, after a while, you run so many experiments that it becomes a way of life. That's the way I see it. When this client couldn't, ultimate client, observed the team improving so fast and so quick, he wanted to meet me. And so I went to, it was a CIO of a company. And I said to him, you don't understand. I run experiments pretty much. I run about 5 experiments every week, which means every week I'm 5 experiments older than you. When you die, how old would you rather be? 2 experiments old or 20,000, right? Don't do the calculation. You can't do 20,000 experiments in a lifetime, at least not with this method. But the idea there is this: we are seeking to explore, right? To change the way things are done and whatever. During COVID, a lot of people stayed put, of course, like, because you had to. And so I did. So what I did was I started actually playing table tennis in virtual reality. I lost 27 kilograms in my sitting room by doing that. And because, of course, I wanted to win, it wasn't about losing weight. And so it's amazing simulator, like a lot of stuff. Then I joined the club this September, an actual club. I have, Chinese coaching. Physical. Chinese coaching and whatever. And so they asked me, can you help on the website? And I said, I don't know if I have time. Anyways, at the end, I did it. So
Yeah.
I rebuilt the website. I recreated tools pretty much to create tournaments. We have a new rating system based on, if you remember, like FaceMash before Facebook.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah.
That essentially one player against another.
Yeah.
In 3 days, I did a minimum viable product, like something super quick. Anyways, it turns out last Saturday we got to the award thing, because we became, by Table Tennis Ireland, the new club of 2022. They called us the internet sensation. We doubled our the people essentially in our club. And there's constantly now new ideas, right? So what I'm saying is that once you start actually running experiments, you can see opportunity for growth everywhere. Everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Of course, I work a lot more these days. I work a lot more in terms of external innovation, outward innovation, but there's opportunities absolutely everywhere.
Well, it's embracing that curiosity. It's like, really experimentation is like being curious and saying, like, what if, right? Let's try it out. And a lot of times, especially in the current environment, it seems like everybody's too busy to ask that question and to be curious. It's like almost, I got too much on my plate. I don't have time for that. I'm going to do this and then move on to the next thing. And
well, what I would suggest is do a list of all the tasks you're doing. Yeah. And then you start with the ones you have to do, the ones you want to do, and the ones that someone else should do. Okay. Take something off your plate, essentially, because there are better things, or, Stephen Covey would call them quadrant two activities, effectively activities that maybe they're not urgent, but they would improve your career, life, or whatever, right? They are important, maybe not urgent, but they are important. So do that, just write a list, prioritize it, try to delegate to someone else, learn some delegation and levels of delegation as well.
Exactly.
So and then very often when people say don't have time is a matter of priority. Where do you put that priority? And it's easy enough to get caught in the system, right? And be oppressed pretty much by the system. But there are always ways if you think hard, I believe.
Well, hard, and I think another, at least from Popcorn Flow or your message, is like those small experiments, like, those, it reminds me of that book of Atomic Habits, like just small little things can make a huge difference. It's easier to do a smaller experiment than larger thing. It's either to get people engaged.
Absolutely.
Easier to, I know with my wife too, it's easier if I ask her for a smaller commitment versus a bigger commitment. So.
I should be ashamed to say that, but the good thing about Popcorn Flow, it starts with one person, and that person is you. Whoever is listening, you can start with that. You don't need everybody to agree. You don't need to even say, oh, I have this new cool idea or tool. You start applying it in a I call it stealth, in a stealth way. And essentially you say, I see the problem this way, or I see this problem. Do you see it the same? Okay. I was thinking about addressing it in this way. Is there some other way? So effectively you use it without using the terminology, or whatever. And I used it at personal level. I have tons of stories like family, friends, and whatever. And you can use it at work as well. But the key is that small experiment. Maybe I didn't emphasize it enough, but you really pointed out well. You start with a common problem, and then the next really step is you do a little experiment. And often you may not totally agree on a direction, but because the experiment is small enough, you may agree to actually do it, as long as you think that is coherent with the problem that we actually have, right? To address the problem we actually have. Exactly. What happens very often is, as you start actually doing these experiments, this is very consistent with complexity. The system changes in a way that these problems dissolve. You know what I mean? It's not problem solving as I'm eradicating the cause.
Typical,
it's just
exactly.
That the system orients itself in a way that you change the disposition of it. And so you don't have to actually completely solve a problem. It's just that the problem becomes a known problem anymore, or something else emerges.
I mean, same as like technical debt, right? If you're continuously thinking about technical debt and you refactor and you're thinking about it, you're always going to have the problems. You're always going to have technical debt, but it's more that it's something that you do and address and think about. It's not something that you retrospectively are kind of thinking about it. So I see it. You
make it as part of the new development.
It's part, exactly,
right? So,
exactly, yeah. Another thing, the popcorn, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but the popcorn flow, especially like from what's the problem, what options do you have, what are possible experiments, what are you going to commit to, reminds me of a coaching arc in professional coaching, right?
Right.
So it is.
Essentially, I use this shadow way of popcorn flowing, I guess, as a coach myself. To me, like, if you want to learn really how to coach, I'm 100% sure it's not the only way, but one way you may consider is to really embrace these kind of steps, because they're very common. Like it's not like some rocket science in any way. It uses a lot of psychology, though. You start on the problem rather than your solution. You talk about options. You co-design the options. Now you can. Often you can buy options from others, right? You go external to your team. I call it, you can create options, buy options, co-design options, or trade them. That's another level. But the point being is you can come up with options. And here's another thing, right? When we talk about a problem, you go to a restaurant, you want to eat, fine, you have a menu. It's quite rare that people ask what's not on the menu. So once you come up with options, effectively, you change the conversation from I should do it or not do it to which one. Okay, it's something you learn as well when you do proposals, to clients. Give them options, right? It's not about let's do it together or not. It's which one. Okay, and so that's the same. So there's that psychological aspect, and then effectively, you explore one of more options with little experiments. Okay, so there's a number of mechanisms that together make it as a really good way to explore decisions. So I want to coach someone. How is this person thinking?
Exactly.
Okay. So I've been doing quite a bit of mentoring. In fact, I'm doing mentoring right now. And we started actually using Popcorn Flow a lot. Just to say, okay, what's the problem this week? What problem do you have? Let's talk about that. Okay, what options have you already considered? Have you considered this other option, perhaps? Okay, how can we start exploring this?
Exactly. That's why I think it's on so many different levels. It's like so simple, but yet you kind of put together like this flow that can be very helpful in different contexts. One-on-one, when you're talking with a team about solving the problems, and the powerful way of combining that mentoring and coaching into it is.
And I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, because I found that when you apply something to everything, it means it applies to nothing. and I had that kind of personal issue of actually say, what should I attack first? Because right now in this period, I'm working with corporate startups. So it's pure innovation, okay? Pure innovation. But for a long time, I've been using Popcorn Flow within these teams, software development teams and whatever. And then I use it with my family. And then I've used it with friends. We used it in schools. We used it in so many things. And you realize, okay, it's too much. Fatih blocked me. I was writing. You're talking about being blocked about writing a book.
I was going to ask you, when is the book?
Yeah, I know. I've not been focusing on that, and I feel it. I'm doing a disservice to humanity. I know that, but I've been also blocked by all this, right? And one thing I figured out, though, is that life is made of decisions. Except very often we don't decide, right? We just go with the flow. We're like zombies in Zombieland. You say, okay, this thing is appearing in my calendar. Let's just do it or whatever. So we go literally with the flow. We don't make a conscious choice, right?
Yeah.
And so we are zombies in Zombieland. That's the way I look at it. The only reason we don't recognize it is because we are them. They look like us. It is us. I'm not saying, you're a zombie and I'm not. We are,
all
the enemies
zombies.
of ourselves. We're all zombies. And so we need to make those kind of decisions. And Pack and Flow, what I found was it's a decision cycle at the core, right? There is a philosophy, there are principles. Those principles weren't born out of, I'll start with the principles and then we do the methodology. It's more like by applying it, they emerged, right? You observe these principles emerging. That mindset, that culture emerged. Okay. Exactly. You can see that in teams applying systematically this kind of methodologies. A certain mindset evolves, emerges. So that's really what I find cool. So I don't mind if people say, oh, Pack and Flow it's this board, it's the popcorn board. Why it's got the popcorn name, by the way? It's because the beginning of each step makes the word popcorn. Okay, very simple. Problems, options, possible experience, committed ongoing review next. So they make the word popcorn. I don't mind when people just use that board, for example, and they don't think that much about the principles, because at some point those principles will emerge. It's like when I don't know if you know anything about the Belbin model of skills acquisition, not Belbin, the Dreyfus model of skills acquisition. They say pretty much like in every skill, at the beginning, the object orientation or how to cook, principles are too early, right? So you want to start with, give me a recipe and I'll work my way through. It's
almost like the Karate Kid, start with the...
Yeah, that's exactly it. Start with the board, and just do that. And so it is a decision cycle at its core. My point is that life is made of decisions. And so this helps us navigate life. And that's why you can adapt it to different fields, really.
It's also like, I think it's that combination of practices and systems, because when you apply even the board, you're kind of changing the system, because you're forcing people to make decisions, and also which goes back to what I said, is reflect on those decisions and say what we're going to do next. And that creates that learning environment.
That's true. Some people struggle sometimes where retrospectives, for example, are not that effective, so they hire, we hire and fire products and services to get the job done, if you use the Johnson methodology. So they hire the Pack and Flow board to help them do the retrospective, right? Very often we get bored, we change like systems and whatever, then we complain that we don't have outcomes at the end of a retrospective. With Pack and Flow, you always have at least an experiment, that you agreed to do pretty much for the week, perhaps. So some people do use it in that context, so to have them reflect as a team within a retrospective. Other people use it on a daily basis. Other people use it at personal level. Managers at high level, they take sometimes strategic decisions. Why is that? Because the one of the risky ways is to say, should we go this super expensive way or that other expensive way? Should we buy this company for 25 million or should we do this other thing? And it's really hard to choose, and it's very risky. So with Pack and Flow, one thing, if you think about launching an experiment, means that you're actually delaying committing to the whole option. I'm just exploring it in a way. And so we're using what is called like real options, right? You don't commit to an option until you know why. So you're
and the experiments allow you to learn and make hopefully more informed decision rather than
Exactly. Let's remember we're surfing on this, and it's still, there's a lot of unknowns, but we're beginning effectively to form some more educated view of the world that we are operating on. So
it's been an hour, Claudio.
Oh wow,
it's been great. It's crazy how we could
I told you I could talk forever.
No, but this is interesting stuff, and that's what's nice about these What would you like to leave us with? A message or takeaway, or what would you like to end with?
To me, look, it's more like, if you find anything of interest, you can see some of my talks perhaps around the web. You can go to my website, but it's more about try it. What do you have to lose? Like, really, it's the time investment, treat it as an experiment. I'm not saying use this method or another method. I obviously, I'm partial to Park and Flow because it really served me for a long time now. And but what I'm saying is treat everything, including Park and Flow, like a little experiment, something that you can design and say, for the next 2-3 iterations, perhaps. So if you're doing, if you're developing software, for the next few weeks, I want to try Park and Flow. My expectation is that it will work. People will be happy, and they will want to continue using it. This is really often how I introduce this, if it's in a very public sort of way. Otherwise, I sneak in with a stealth, essentially. I just do what I want to do, right? And that's really what I would like to say, is treat it as an experiment, or at least think about an experiment you can do. Maybe try just with one experiment. It may not even be Park and Flow at all. It could be something you want to try in the family. Maybe a problem is you want to be closer to your family. Okay, what options do you have? Maybe we're working a lot. I don't know, maybe a little experiment could be to do a meal in your next weekend or something like that. Even if you burn everything, I think people will in your family will appreciate it if you don't do it often, right? But treat it as an experiment. Write it down. What's the action? What do you expect at the end of that? So do a meal would be the action, for example, for my family on the weekend. My expectation again would be that people will like buy food. Maybe you do a meal with some of your kids if you have kids, or maybe you involve somebody in the family. Your expectation is that at the end of that, family will be happy and they will want you to do it more often. And you feel, because the expectation doesn't have to be a fact, it could be also a feeling, and you feel that actually you are indeed closer to your family than maybe you are right now.
Yeah,
right?
And you just gave me an idea. So I think I'm going to apply it to this. So the problem that I have is I need to start writing again. So I need to come up with a bunch of options or experiments, like waking up like I did earlier in the morning, or trying the late at night, whatever it is, but run a bunch of experiments to help me get back to writing. So
but for example, you can think in terms of actually options that you can borrow from others, right? So for example, there are tools I can't remember now the name, but there is one tool, for example, where you literally set up a video conference call with a perfect stranger for an hour, or for 50 minutes or 25 minutes. And you could say, I'll start writing by doing that. The only rule there is that you have to have your video on with this stranger. You say, you introduce yourself very quickly. You say, what's your goal for the day? What's my goal for the day? I used it a few times. And the peer pressure, like suddenly. So you can find different options to actually say, I need to write. What options do I have? You can come up with some. You can get someone very naive who can give you more options, so you're buying them from others. And then you say, well, which one seems interesting? I want to try that.